The streets of New York pulsed with their usual vibrancy as Keanu Reeves stepped out of a quaint cafe nestled in a quiet pocket of the bustling city. The morning sunlight glinted off the skyscrapers, casting golden streaks across the sidewalks. Keanu, clad in his signature black blazer, dark jeans, and a loosely draped scarf, adjusted his sunglasses and glanced briefly at the busy street ahead. Despite his fame, he moved with an understated ease, blending seamlessly into the urban tapestry. As he approached a sleek black sedan parked near the curb, ready to whisk him off to his next engagement, a gentle tug on his sleeve halted him mid-stride. Startled, he turned to find himself looking down at a young girl, no older than 9. Her eyes, wide and brimming with unspoken emotion, were set in a pale, delicate face framed by a completely bald head. She wore worn clothes, her sneakers scuffed and faded, and her small hands gripped a paper cup that jingled faintly with the weight of scattered coins. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quivering yet brave. As she looked up at him, "Can you help me?" Keanu immediately knelt down to her level, his expression softening as he gazed into her vulnerable eyes. "Of course," he replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "What's wrong?" Before the girl could respond, an angry voice cut through the moment. "That kid's nothing but trouble." Keanu's eyes shifted upward to see a man in a stained apron stomping toward them. His face was flushed with irritation, and his finger jabbed toward the girl accusingly. "She's always hanging around my shop, scaring off the customers," he spat, his voice laced with frustration. "Never buys anything, just stand there loitering." Keanu rose slowly, his calm demeanor unwavering as he turned to face the man. "Has she done something wrong?" he asked, his tone measured but carrying an undertone of quiet authority. The man faltered, caught off guard by Keanu's steady gaze. "Well, no," he admitted grudgingly, "but she's always there, messing with the merchandise, making people uncomfortable. I run a business, you know." Keanu tilted his head slightly, a subtle frown forming. "Sometimes, people aren't where they want to be," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of thoughtfulness. "But where they need to be. Maybe you should ask why she's here before you judge her so harshly." The man hesitated, shifting uncomfortably before muttering something under his breath and retreating back to his store. Keanu turned back to the girl, who had shrunk behind him during the exchange, her small hands trembling. "It's okay," he said gently, kneeling once more. "Don't let him scare you. What's your name?" "Lyla," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the city. "Lyla," he repeated, offering her a reassuring smile. "Where's your family?" Her gaze fell to the pavement. "I don't have one. I live at a shelter. St. Mary's." Keanu's brows furrowed as he studied her frail figure more closely. "Are you sick?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with concern. Lyla nodded hesitantly, tears threatening to spill from her wide eyes. "They said I have cancer," she admitted, her voice trembling. "The shelter doesn't have enough money for my treatment. I've been trying to save." She gestured weakly to the paper cup in her hands. "But it's not enough." Keanu felt his chest tighten at the weight of her words. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes locking onto hers with quiet determination. "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Keanu made a quick call to his driver, instructing him to wait. Then, he guided Lyla to the car, opening the door for her before settling in beside her. As the sedan wove through the bustling streets, Lyla began to open up, sharing bits and pieces of her life at the shelter. She spoke of Sister Margaret, the kind but overburdened woman who ran St. Mary's, and of the other children she lived with. Her voice was tinged with both gratitude and sadness as she described her daily struggles, the longing to feel normal, and her fear of what lay ahead. When they arrived at St. Mary's, the building was exactly as Lyla had described, weathered and small, its faded bricks and creaking doorways speaking of decades of service and sacrifice. Sister Margaret greeted them at the door, her face lighting up with relief when she saw Lyla. "Thank you for bringing her back," she said, her voice warm but tired. Her eyes flicked to Keanu, and her expression shifted to one of recognition and mild disbelief. "Wait, are you?" Keanu smiled faintly and held up a hand. "Let's focus on Lyla for now," he said. Inside, over a cup of tea in the shelter's modest kitchen, Sister Margaret shared the challenges St. Mary's faced: limited resources, an aging building, and the rising costs of healthcare had left them struggling to meet the needs of the children in their care. Keanu listened intently, his expression growing more thoughtful with each passing minute. When Sister Margaret finished, he set his mug down and leaned forward. "I want to help," he said simply. "I'll cover the cost of Lila's treatment, everything she needs. And I'd like to do more for the shelter too." Sister Margaret's eyes widened, her hand flying to her chest. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Reeves. But I don't know how we could ever repay you." "You don't have to," Keanu replied, his tone gentle but firm. "No child should have to face what Lila's going through alone. Let me do this." The following days were a whirlwind. Lyla was admitted to a nearby hospital, where Keanu ensured she received the best possible care. He stayed by her side through every test and consultation, his presence a steady source of comfort. When the doctors outlined a treatment plan involving surgery and chemotherapy, Lila's fear resurfaced. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu took her small hand in his eyes filled with quiet conviction. "We're going to fight this together," he said, "and no matter what, you'll never have to do it alone." Meanwhile, Keanu began working with Sister Margaret to renovate St. Mary's. He arranged for new beds, fresh paint, and even a small clinic to be added to the facility. The children's laughter soon echoed through the halls, a testament to the hope his kindness had restored. Lila's surgery was a success, and as she began her recovery, she became a beacon of inspiration for everyone at the shelter. On Christmas Eve, Keanu returned to St. Mary's, bearing gifts for all the children. As they gathered around him, their faces glowing with joy, he knelt beside Lyla, who wore a golden bracelet he had given her for luck. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes shining with gratitude. Keanu smiled, his voice warm. "You've taught me more than you'll ever know. Lyla, keep being brave and never stop dreaming." And in that moment, amidst the warmth and laughter of St. Mary's, it was clear that kindness had the power to change lives, and that even the smallest acts of compassion could spark a world of hope. Keanu rose to his full height, his calm yet resolute presence cutting through the store owner's indignation. "Has she actually done anything wrong?" he asked, his tone steady, yet with an unmistakable firmness that demanded an honest response. The man hesitated, his earlier bravado faltering. "No, not exactly," he admitted reluctantly. "But she's always hanging around, making the place look bad. People don't want to see her here." Keanu's expression shifted, a subtle frown creasing his brow. He glanced back at the little girl standing silently behind him, her small frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the store owner's harsh words. "Sometimes," Keanu said softly, "people don't belong in places where judgment comes easier than kindness." The man muttered something inaudible under his breath before turning on his heel and retreating to the store. Keanu didn't spare him another glance, his attention now fully on the child before him. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to meet her at eye level. "Lyla," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her tiny hands clutched the paper cup she carried, the coins inside jingling faintly with every nervous movement. "Lyla," Keanu repeated, his voice gentle, like he was tasting the name for the first time. "Where's your family? Are they nearby?" Her gaze dropped to the cracked pavement beneath her feet, and for a long moment, she didn't answer. Finally, she shook her head. "I don't have a family," she murmured, her voice so soft it was nearly lost in the noise of the city. "I live at St. Mary's shelter." Keanu's eyes softened, concern evident in the way his brows knit together. He glanced at her frail frame, noticing the sharp angles of her shoulders and the dark shadows beneath her eyes. Something was clearly wrong. "Are you sick, Lyla?" he asked gently, his tone encouraging but not pressing. Her small shoulders sagged under the weight of his question. She nodded slowly, her chin trembling as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. "The doctor said, I have cancer," she admitted, her words trembling with vulnerability. The shelter doesn't have enough money for my treatment. I've been trying to save, but it's not enough." The heartbreaking reality of her words hit Keanu like a physical blow. He let out a quiet breath. His heart breaking for this little girl who carried such a heavy burden on her tiny shoulders. Without hesitation, he knelt closer, his steady hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Lyla," he said firmly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "You don't have to do this alone. We're going to figure this out together. I promise." As the promise hung in the air between them, Keanu quickly pulled out his phone and made a call to his driver. "We're going to St. Mary's," he said, his tone decisive. "I'll need you to take us there." Lyla hesitated as Keanu gestured toward the sleek black car waiting at the curb. "It's okay," he reassured her, his tone warm and calming. "You're safe with me." They climbed into the car, and as the city blurred past the windows, Lyla began to open up. She talked about her life at St. Mary's, about Sister Margaret, the kind but overworked woman who ran the shelter. She spoke of the other children she lived with, her words tinged with both fondness and sadness. She shared how, despite her illness, she loved helping Sister Margaret with the younger kids and how they would sometimes sing songs together at night to chase away their fears. Keanu listened intently, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed every word. When she fell silent, he said, "You're very brave, Lyla, braver than most people I've met." Her cheeks flushed with a hint of pride, though her eyes still carried the weight of her struggles. When they arrived at St. Mary's, the shelter looked exactly as Lyla had described, small, weathered, and clearly underfunded. The brick facade was faded, and the windows were clouded with grime. Sister Margaret greeted them at the door, her face lighting up with relief as she saw Lyla step out of the car. "Lyla, I was so worried about you," she exclaimed, pulling the girl into a warm embrace. Keanu introduced himself, but Sister Margaret's recognition was instant. "You're Keanu Reeves," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Yes," Keanu replied with a gentle smile, "but today's not about me. It's about Lyla." Inside, they sat in the shelter's modest kitchen, a small room cluttered with mismatched chairs and chipped mugs. Over a cup of tea, Sister Margaret shared the challenges the shelter faced: limited funding, outdated facilities, and an ever-growing number of children in need. Keanu listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she finished, he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I want to help," he said simply. "I'll cover the cost of Lyla's treatment, everything she needs. And I'd like to do more for St. Mary's. These kids deserve better." Sister Margaret's eyes filled with tears, her hand trembling as she placed it over her heart. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to," Keanu said softly. "Just let me help." In the days that followed, Keanu kept his promise. He worked with the doctors to ensure Lyla received the best possible care, sparing no expense. He also began working with Sister Margaret to renovate the shelter, bringing in new beds, fresh paint, and even a small playroom for the children. Lyla's surgery was a success, and as she began her recovery, she became a beacon of hope for the other children. She often told them stories about her friend Keanu, who had come to her rescue like a hero in a fairy tale. One day, as Keanu visited the shelter, he found Lyla sitting with a group of younger kids, her laughter filling the room as they played a game together. She looked up and waved, her smile bright and full of life. In that moment, Keanu felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He knew this was why he was here, to make a difference, one life at a time. And so, in the heart of New York, a little girl named Lyla taught the world's most unlikely hero that true strength lies in compassion, and that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to transform lives. Keanu Reeves, his voice calm and steady, made a quick call to his driver, instructing him to hold back for a while. Turning his attention to Lyla, he guided her gently to the car, ensuring she was seated comfortably in the soft leather interior. As the city blurred past the windows, Lyla, hesitant at first, began to open up. She spoke in a quiet voice about her life, the painful loss of her parents, and how she had found herself at St. Mary's shelter. Her words painted a vivid picture of resilience and heartbreak, tinged with the innocence of a child who refused to give up. She described Sister Margaret, the kind woman who had taken her in and given her a place to call home, even amidst the shelter's many struggles. Lyla's eyes grew sad as she spoke of her illness and the small, desperate steps she had taken to fund her own treatment, begging on streets, counting every penny, hoping for a miracle. Keanu listened intently, his face reflecting empathy and determination. He didn't interrupt, letting her share her story in full. "You're incredibly brave, Lyla," he said softly, his words laced with sincerity. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore." When they arrived at St. Mary's, the modest shelter stood before them like a quiet monument to perseverance. The faded brick walls and peeling paint seemed to tell a story of years spent weathering storms, both literal and figurative. As Keanu stepped out of the car, he was greeted warmly at the entrance by Sister Margaret, a gentle-faced woman in her 60s who radiated a mix of relief and gratitude upon seeing Lyla. "Thank you for bringing her back," Sister Margaret said, pulling Lyla into a tender embrace. Her voice trembled slightly as she added, "She means the world to us." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's my pleasure," he replied, "but I'd like to talk about how I can help her and the other children here." Sister Margaret's face softened further, and she invited Keanu into the shelter. Inside, the space was as humble as the exterior suggested: worn furniture, faded walls, and an air of determined optimism. They sat together at a small wooden table in the kitchen, where Sister Margaret poured 2 steaming cups of tea. Lyla sat quietly nearby, watching the interaction with wide, curious eyes. For the next hour, Sister Margaret spoke candidly about the shelter's many challenges. She described the limited funding they received, which barely covered food and basic supplies. The growing number of children in need often left them overcrowded, with resources stretched far too thin. Medical care, she explained, was an even greater struggle. "We do what we can," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion, "but it's never enough." Keanu listened intently, his gaze steady and thoughtful. He occasionally asked questions, gently prompting Sister Margaret to elaborate on specific issues. It was clear from his demeanor that he wasn't just being polite, he truly cared. When Sister Margaret finished, Keanu leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His voice, though calm, carried a weight of determination. "Let me take care of Lyla's medical expenses," he said, his words deliberate. "I'll cover her treatment, transportation, everything she needs." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his offer hanging in the air like a quiet miracle. Lyla, who had been sitting silently beside him, looked up with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Really?" she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Keanu turned to her, offering a gentle smile. "Really," he assured her. "You deserve a chance to get better, and I want to make sure you have that." Sister Margaret blinked back tears, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Keanu shook his head, his expression kind but resolute. "You don't need to thank me," he said gently. "This isn't about gratitude, it's about doing what's right." Lyla's small voice broke through the quiet. "Does this mean I don't have to save anymore?" she asked, her tone a mixture of hope and disbelief. Keanu's smile softened as he looked at her. "That's right, Lyla," he said. "You can focus on getting better now. Leave the rest to me." As the conversation continued, Keanu began asking more about the shelter itself, its operations, its needs, and the children who called it home. Sister Margaret explained how they struggled not just with funding, but with creating a safe, nurturing environment for the kids. The shelter, she said, was in desperate need of repairs, and there was so much more they wished they could do. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his mind clearly working through possibilities. "What if we could do more than just fix things?" he asked after a moment of thought. "What if we could make this place everything it needs to be, and more?" Sister Margaret looked at him, her expression equal parts hopeful and uncertain. "What do you mean?" she asked hesitantly. "I mean expanding," Keanu replied. "Renovating this space or finding a larger one." maybe even setting up a small clinic on site, so kids like Lyla can get the care they need without extra stress. His voice was calm, but his words carried an undeniable sense of purpose. I want to help make that happen. By the time Keanu left St. Mary's that evening, plans were already beginning to take shape. He had spoken with Sister Margaret in detail about what the shelter needed most and promised to return with resources to make it happen. Lyla stood at the door as he prepared to leave, her small hand clutching his. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. Keanu crouched down to her level, his smile warm and reassuring. "You're welcome, Lyla," he said. "But remember, this is just the beginning. We're going to make sure you, and all the kids here, have the future you deserve." As he walked back to his car, the faded shelter behind him, Keanu couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. He had come to New York for business, but what he found instead was something far more meaningful, a chance to make a difference, one life at a time. And in his heart, he knew this was only the start of something much greater. The following morning, Lyla was admitted to a renowned children's hospital, her small frame dwarfed by the bustling hallways and towering medical equipment. Despite the intimidating environment, Keanu never left her side. He held her tiny hand with gentle reassurance, his deep voice weaving stories about his films and the adventures he had encountered on set. His words painted vibrant pictures that brought a flicker of light to her wide, nervous eyes. Along with him, he carried a stack of books he had handpicked from his personal collection and a DVD of her favorite movie, determined to make her feel as comfortable as possible. As the day unfolded, a team of doctors conducted a series of thorough tests to assess Lyla's condition. Though the machines hummed and beeped around her, Lyla found herself focusing on Keanu's presence. He made her laugh with tales of clumsy moments during his action scenes, and for a while, the weight of her fears seemed to lift. Later, the lead doctor sat down with them to explain the course of action. The treatment plan was detailed and daunting: surgery to remove the tumor, followed by several cycles of chemotherapy. Though the explanation was calm and professional, the enormity of what lay ahead caused Lyla's bravery to falter. Her small hands clenched tightly around the blanket as she looked up at Keanu, her voice breaking with vulnerability. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. Keanu knelt beside her gurney, his eyes level with hers, filled with kindness and understanding. His voice, steady and warm, carried the weight of reassurance. "Lyla," he began gently, "do you know what being brave really means? It doesn't mean you're not scared. It's okay to feel scared. Being brave means you keep going, even when you are. And let me tell you something. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met." Lyla blinked back tears, her lip trembling as she absorbed his words. "Really?" she whispered, searching his face for the truth. Keanu nodded firmly. "Really? You've already come so far, and I'll be with you every step of the way." A nurse entered the room to begin preparations for the surgery, the sterile efficiency of her movements reminding Lyla of what was to come. Her breath quickened, and she gripped Keanu's hand tightly. "Will you be here when I wake up?" she asked, her voice trembling. Keanu placed his other hand over hers, his touch warm and steady. His gaze softened as he leaned in closer, his voice a quiet promise. "I'll be right here," he said, his tone unwavering. "When you wake up, I'll be the first face you see. That's a promise." Lyla. Her tears spilled over, but for the first time that day, a small, hopeful smile curved her lips. "Okay," she whispered, nodding as the nurse gently began to wheel her toward the operating room. As the gurney disappeared through the swinging doors, Keanu stood in the hallway, his hands slipping into his pockets. He watched until the last glimpse of Lyla's pale face was gone, then took a deep breath to steady himself. He turned to the head nurse, his voice calm but resolute. "I'll be here. Let me know the moment she's out of surgery." The nurse nodded, offering a kind smile. "We will, Mr. Reeves. She's in good hands." Finding a quiet corner of the waiting area, Keanu settled into a chair, but his mind remained restless. The minutes stretched into hours, every tick of the clock punctuating the weight of his thoughts. His phone buzzed intermittently with calls and messages from his team, but he silenced it, unwilling to let anything pull him away from Lyla's side. This was where he needed to be. As he waited, he replayed her words in his mind, the fear, the hope, the trust she had placed in him. It was humbling, and it solidified his resolve. Whatever it took, he would make sure Lyla had a future filled with more than just survival. He envisioned her running, laughing, and living without fear, a child deserving of all the magic life could offer. When the surgeon finally stepped into the waiting room, Keanu rose to his feet instantly. The doctor's expression was calm but focused, a hint of optimism in his tone. "The surgery went well," he announced. "We were able to remove the tumor successfully. She'll need time to recover and will still require chemotherapy. But this was a crucial first step." Relief washed over Keanu like a tidal wave. He nodded, his shoulders loosening for the first time all day. "Thank you, doctor," he said, his voice genuine and heartfelt. The nurse led him to the recovery room where Lyla lay, her small figure nestled under crisp white sheets. She looked fragile but peaceful, her breathing steady as she began to stir. Keanu stepped quietly to her bedside, placing a small hand-knit blanket, a gift he had brought earlier, over her shoulders. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually fixed on him. "You're here," she murmured, her voice barely audible but laced with gratitude. Keanu crouched beside her, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Of course," he said softly. "I promised, didn't I?" Lyla's hand found his, her fingers curling weakly around his. Though her voice was faint, her words carried the strength of 1,000 unspoken thank yous. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu squeezed her hand gently. "Rest now, Lyla," he said, his voice steady and comforting. "This is just the beginning of your story, and I'm going to make sure it's a good one." As her eyes drifted shut once more, Keanu stayed by her side, a quiet guardian in her newfound journey toward healing. Hours later, when the surgeon finally emerged from the operating room, both Keanu and Sister Margaret rose to their feet, their breaths caught in anxious anticipation. The doctor's calm but focused expression brought immediate comfort. "The surgery went well," he began, his voice steady. "We were able to remove the tumor successfully. However, Lyla will still need ongoing treatments, including chemotherapy, to ensure her recovery." Relief washed over them like a warm wave. Keanu nodded firmly, his jaw set with determination. "We'll make sure she gets everything she needs," he said. His voice carried a quiet strength, a promise not just to the doctor but to Lyla and everyone who had placed their hopes in him. Sister Margaret placed a hand over her heart, tears brimming in her kind eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her gratitude too immense for words. In the recovery room, soft light filtered through the window, casting a golden glow over Lyla's small frame. Her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze adjusting to the sight of Keanu sitting by her bedside. He smiled warmly, his presence as steady as it had been since the day they met. "Hey, there," he said softly, leaning closer. From his pocket, he pulled out a small golden bracelet and placed it gently in her hand. "This is for you," he said, "for luck. I think every brave girl deserves something to remind her how strong she is." Lyla turned the bracelet over in her fingers, her expression shifting from surprise to wonder. Her voice, still weak but filled with gratitude, carried barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Keanu smiled again, his hand resting lightly on the edge of her bed. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "You've done all the hard work. Now it's time to rest." In the days that followed, Keanu's commitment to Lyla and the shelter grew. He wasn't content to simply fund her medical care. He wanted to ensure that St. Mary's could continue to serve as a place of hope for every child who walked through its doors. Partnering with Sister Margaret, he set up a comprehensive fund to support not only Lyla's treatment, but also the renovation and expansion of the shelter itself. Within weeks, the transformation began. Plans were drawn to add a new wing to the shelter, complete with a small library and a learning center. A healthcare clinic was included in the design, ensuring that children like Lyla could access the care they needed without obstacles. Contractors arrived. Donations poured in from inspired individuals who heard Keanu's story. And soon, St. Mary's began to transform from a place of struggle into a haven of possibilities. Lyla's recovery became a beacon of resilience for everyone at the shelter. As her treatments continued, her strength returned, and with it came her laughter. The sparkle in her eyes, dulled by illness and hardship, reignited. She began to dream again, often telling Sister Margaret about her plans to help other children in need one day. "Keanu helped me," she would say with quiet conviction. "I want to be like him when I grow up." On Christmas Eve, the shelter was alive with celebration. The scent of freshly baked cookies wafted through the halls, mingling with the sound of carols sung by the children. Lyla, wearing her golden bracelet, stood by the tree, her smile brighter than the twinkling lights that adorned it. The room buzzed with excitement as Keanu stepped through the doors, carrying a large sack of gifts over his shoulder. The children rushed toward him, their faces lighting up as he knelt down to greet each one with a warm smile and a kind word. He handed out wrapped packages, each carefully chosen to bring joy to its recipient. When it was Lyla's turn, she hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around him with all the strength she could muster. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "For everything." Keanu returned the hug, his eyes softening as he looked down at her. "You don't need to thank me, Lyla," he said gently. "Just promise me something." She tilted her head, her curious eyes meeting his. "What?" "Promise me you'll keep being brave," he said, his voice carrying both warmth and gravity. "And never stop dreaming." Lyla nodded, her smile wide and genuine. "I promise." That night, as snow began to fall gently outside, the shelter glowed with warmth and laughter. Keanu sat by the fire, surrounded by children, sharing stories and answering their eager questions. Sister Margaret watched from a distance, her heart full of gratitude as she saw the joy that had returned to the children's lives. For everyone at St. Mary's, Keanu was no longer just a movie star. He had become a symbol of hope, a living reminder that kindness, no matter how big or small, had the power to change lives. As the evening came to a close, Lyla stood by the window, watching the snowflakes drift down onto the city streets. She touched the bracelet on her wrist, a small but profound reminder of how far she had come. Behind her, the sound of laughter and joy filled the room, a melody of resilience and unity. For Keanu, the journey with Lyla and the shelter was more than a single act of generosity. It was a testament to the human spirit, a reaffirmation of the power of compassion. And as he prepared to leave that night, he carried with him the knowledge that he had not just changed lives, he had been changed, too.